Welcome back to my channel. My name is Allison and I'm your source for all things cool, creepy, and cryptid. So, for today's story, I want to tell you guys a little bit about a really interesting place that is up in Williamsburg, Virginia. Williamsburg is kind of a hot seat for haunted activity anyway because it is an original colonial spot. There is a lot of weird things that's happened there. It's also a hot seat for Civil War haunted activity. And the story that I am about to tell you kind of crosses both of those time periods, which is really interesting. So today I want to tell you a little bit about the public house for persons of insane and disordered minds. Now, this was the first building of its kind to ever be erected in North America. This was the first insane asylum totally and intentionally dedicated to the treatment of mentally ill people. It wasn't a ward for criminally insane, it was a treatment facility, which, like I said, had never been done in North America before. Now, it's interesting because it's also incredibly long-standing. The first patient was actually admitted to this facility on October 12th of 1773. So it literally stems all the way back to colonial Williamsburg. Super cool. Most people weren't even thinking about the treatment of the mentally insane or unstable at this time. It just wasn't that much of a thing. However, with the rise of the Enlightenment, Governor Fauquier, who was the governor over Williamsburg at this time, he actually believed that Enlightenment science could cause a reason to believe that there was treatment possible for people who were, and I quote, so unhappy that they have become devoid of reason. Now, unfortunately for all of the noble thoughts that Governor Fauquier had, the early days of asylums, as they so usually are, this one is also tainted with a dark and tragic history. There was miserable treatments, and there wasn't much known about how to effectively treat people who were mentally unstable at the time. So patients who were kept at the public hospital were often subjected to treatments such as solitary confinement or being strapped to their bed for days on end. There was electroshock therapy, there was temperature therapy. And that is where they change the temperature of the patient rapidly. And since she keeps trying to make herself known, I'm going to introduce you guys to my kitten. This is Bree. She doesn't want to be held, she just wants to be in the way. So you would take somebody from a really warm place, like a steam bath, and then immediately dunk them in cold water, or vice versa. And the idea was that shocking their system in that way would recalibrate everything and make them come out sane. Now, of course, we know now that most of the time people who are insane either have predisposed positions or they have something that is triggered from a previous condition or something like that. Chemical imbalances, science is much more advanced, clearly, obviously. We've come a long way. But these were the kinds of treatments that people believed would be successful in treating the insane patients of the time. Now, that should have been bad enough to make sure that this site would be haunted. But the story doesn't stop there. So what seems like would have been a positive turn, in 1841, Dr. John Galt took over the asylum. He was the superintendent and lead doctor at the site, and he spent 20 years investing into this asylum, trying to turn around the way that patients were treated and make sure that there was equal and fair treatment for those who were considered insane. Because at this time, as we just discussed, there was not really good treatment for patients who were suffering in that way. They were often treated as less than citizens, people who weren't good enough to survive on the outside world. And Dr. John Galt didn't see it that way. He saw them as people who deserved fair treatment and equal treatment opportunities to get well. So he put a great and valiant effort into redefining the way that we approach mental illness. Again, fairly ahead of his time. But unfortunately, like I said, that only lasted for 20 years. In 1862, the Battle of Williamsburg began in the Civil War, and the South lost that territory, meaning Union soldiers moved in and took whatever they wanted. Now, I'm not saying, unfortunately, the South lost. I don't want anyone to get that twisted, because no, we're not playing that game. But unfortunately, Dr. John Galt was displaced from his position at the hospital because of this. And it became somewhere that was occupied by Union soldiers and doctors, and it became Union territory. So Dr. John Galt lost his entire passion, everything that he loved about treating his patients. He lost his patients, he lost his livelihood. And even though he was allowed to remain in his house, which was on the property, he ended up taking his own life. And he did so by overdosing on an extremely strong opiate called laudanum. I believe I'm saying that correctly. I may not. Med students, don't come for me in the comments. But this type of opiate, when you overdose on it, it causes massive hemorrhaging in the brain, and he bled out through his facial orifices, leaving a horrible blood stain on the hardwood floor of his original house. Shortly after this happened, a family moved in. Their name was the Lee family, and this is when you start to see that Dr. John Galt wasn't ready to leave his patients behind. That blood stain, no matter what Mrs. Lee did, would not come out of those floorboards. She wrote in a letter that she tried everything possible to clean it out and it would not come out. And she went so far as to even have those floorboards ripped up and replaced. And by the next morning, the blood stain was back for her. And there was nothing she could do about it. She also said that the house seemed to torment her children, that they woke up almost every single night and would come to her and they would say, "Mommy, there's a man in our room." And that room happened to be the room where he was pronounced dead. So his spirit wasn't ready to leave that house, and it wasn't ready to leave the asylum behind either. After the Lee family moved out, the house was destroyed. So we have no way to verify or take account of those stories other than through the letters that Mrs. Lee sent. But we do believe that Dr. John Galt moved himself right back down the property, back to the asylum that he loved so much. So now there are people who work at the historical site where the original public hospital stood, and they say that things happen where there are guests touring the hospital and they feel a strange gust of wind come through, or it feels like somebody's brushing past them. And there are often things like, some mornings they come in and it looks like the exhibit bed has been slept in, and most commonly things disappear, things that you wouldn't really notice unless you needed it, and then it's gone, and later that day it reappears somewhere that they know it definitely wasn't. So one of the particular people who works there, she said in an interview, and I want to make sure I source this because it's not my interview. To colonialghosts.com. Which it looks like they are a tour site. So I'm just going to throw this out there. If you want to go tour this area or other haunted Williamsburg things, since this has been a really great source for me to find information on the ghost of the public hospital, check out colonialghosts.com, because it looks like they do ghost tours, group tours, and stuff like that. So yeah. But they said that they've interviewed some of the employees working at the rebuilt public hospital, and one of the employees said that at times Hospital items seem to disappear. No matter how long we search, we can never find them, but the weird thing is that later that same day, they do magically reappear. Sometimes I believe our ghost must be a practical joker. Maybe he's just bored and wants to get into a little mischief. Or, followed up by the person who wrote the article, perhaps long after his tragic death, the kind Dr. Galt does occupy the asylum he loved so much. So I just thought that was really, really interesting. That we do have stories of things that have happened from people who are currently working and actively in the hospital at this time. Now, like I said, you can always go check out Colonial Ghosts if you want to take a tour. There are lots of really cool and creepy sites in Williamsburg, Virginia. And that's a story for another video. Until then, stay weird, stay woke, and always look under the bed.